Every story has a moment that works as its true beginning, not the moment the cameras would choose, not the moment the headlines would pick, but the real beginning, the quiet one, the one that nobody notices when it happens, because it looks, from the outside, like nothing more than a child crossing a street. The real beginning of this story is not the morning the black car arrived. It is not the phone call Patricia made to Boston. It is not the hospital room, or the briefcase, or the legal documents, or the trust fund, or any of the things that would eventually make this story worth telling to a room full of strangers. The real beginning is the morning Maya Watkins woke up before her alarm, before her mother, before the street outside had fully decided to be a street again, and lay in her bed in the dark and thought about the man across the road. She was 9 years old. She had never in her life done anything that anyone would call significant. She had not been asked to do anything significant. Nobody was watching her. Nobody was waiting for her. Nobody would have known or said a word if she had simply turned over in her bed and gone back to sleep. But she did not go back to sleep. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She made oatmeal. She added brown sugar because she had decided, without any particular evidence, that Harold Bennett was the kind of man who had once had someone who made his oatmeal the right way and had not had that in a long time. She wrapped the bowl in a dish towel. She crossed the street. That was the beginning. Everything else was a consequence of that. It's worth spending some time understanding what kind of child Maya Watkins was. Not because children who do remarkable things are always remarkable children in obvious ways, but because Maya's particular kind of remarkableness was the subtle kind, the kind that does not show up on report cards or in performance reviews or in any of the measurements we use to identify the people who are going to matter. She was not the top of her class, though she was not far from it either. She was not the child who ran for student council or organized the bake sale or captained the relay team. She was the child who noticed. That was her specific gift, and it was a gift that the world does not celebrate nearly enough because it does not produce anything visible until it does. And when it does, the thing it produces tends to change everything. Maya noticed when her friend Jasmine came to school 3 days in a row without eating lunch and was pretending she had already eaten, and Maya started bringing 2 sandwiches and leaving one on Jasmine's desk without making it a conversation, because she understood instinctively that Jasmine's dignity mattered as much as her hunger. Maya noticed when the substitute teacher in 3rd grade was trying too hard and getting frustrated, and she raised her hand and asked a question she already knew the answer to, not to show off, but to give the teacher a moment to recover. Maya noticed the house across the street, and Maya did something about it. Patricia Watkins had raised a daughter alone for 9 years by the time any of this happened, and she had done it the way that most single mothers do it in America, which is by finding the line between protection and suffocation and walking it every single day with no guarantee that she was on the right side of it. She had rules. The rules were not negotiable. Maya did not go to strangers' houses. Maya did not talk to people Patricia had not met. Maya did not cross Caldwell Avenue after dark. These were not the rules of a fearful woman, but the rules of a precise one, a woman who had learned that the world does not give Black girls the same margin for error that it gives other children, and who had built her parenting around that reality without letting the reality make her bitter. When she found out about the morning visits, she revised the rules, not because she had stopped believing in them, but because her daughter had shown her something that the rules, as written, had not accounted for, which was that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do for a child is teach them to walk past the person who needs them. She watched every morning from the window. This deserves more attention than it usually gets in the telling of this story, because what Patricia was doing from that window was not passive. She was not simply keeping an eye out. She was learning Harold Bennett the way you learn a person when you watch them long enough and carefully enough without the distortion that conversation introduces. She watched the way he waited before he opened the door and understood that he was gathering himself, that opening the door cost him something. She watched the way he stood just inside the frame and never fully stepped onto the porch, and understood that the boundary was important to him, that he was allowing this but on terms he had established for himself. She watched the way he started, after about 2 months, to have his curtain open slightly in the mornings before Maya arrived, which meant he was watching for her, which meant he was thinking about it before it happened, which meant it had become something he anticipated, rather than something he merely tolerated. Patricia was a woman who worked in a hospital and had spent years watching people in the controlled, fluorescent vulnerability of illness, and she knew what anticipation looked like in a person who had forgotten how to feel it. She saw it in Harold Bennett through a window across the street, and it told her more about who he was and what the visits were doing than any conversation could have. The neighborhood, for its part, had opinions. Neighborhoods always have opinions, especially about things they do not understand and have not been invited to understand. Mrs. Dolores Chapman, 3 doors down from Harold on the same side of the street, was the first to raise it formally, which in the context of Caldwell Avenue meant calling Patricia on a Tuesday evening and saying she was concerned. And Patricia said she appreciated the call and that Maya was fine. And Mrs. Chapman said she was sure Maya was fine. She just wondered whether it was entirely appropriate for a child to be going to that man's house every morning. And Patricia said she had met Harold, and he was a sick, elderly man who appreciated a hot meal. And Mrs. Chapman said she understood that, but still. And Patricia said she was so glad Mrs. Chapman had called and that she would take it under advisement. And then she hung up and went back to preparing Maya's lunch for the next day. There were 2 more calls in that general spirit over the following month. Patricia handled them all the same way. She did not explain herself at length because she had learned that explaining yourself at length to people who have already made up their minds is a form of labor that produces no useful output, and Patricia had no labor to spare. What the neighbors did not understand, because they had not been watching from the window the way Patricia had, was that the relationship between Maya and Harold was not the thing they had decided it was from a distance. It was not a child being naive about danger. It was not an old man cultivating access to a young girl. It was 2 people, separated by 64 years, finding in each other something that neither of them had known they were looking for. Harold had lost the ability, over the years of isolation and decline, to believe that his presence mattered to anyone. Not in a dramatic clinical way, not in a way that required intervention, but in the slow, grinding, everyday way that happens to people when no one reflects back to them that they are here, and that it is good that they are here. Maya's visits did that. Every morning, for the duration of a brief exchange on the doorstep, Harold Bennett existed in someone's world as a person who was expected and welcomed and worth the trip. That is not a small thing. For a man who had been invisible for 11 years, it was immense. And Maya had found something too, though she would not have been able to name it at 9 years old. She had found a person who listened to her the way adults rarely listen to children, which is as though what she was saying had weight, as though her observations about the world were data worth taking seriously, rather than charming approximations of adult thought to be gently corrected and moved past. Harold corrected her grammar and her math and occasionally her logic, but he never corrected her perception. When she told him things she noticed about her classmates or her teachers or the way the oak tree in his front yard looked different in different kinds of light, he received those observations as the genuine intelligence they were. He told her, one morning in what must have been their 5th or 6th month of conversation, that she was going to be someone who understood things that most people miss, and that this was going to be useful to her and occasionally lonely, and that both of those things were true at the same time and that she should know that early. Maya thought about that sentence for 3 days and then came back and asked him what he meant by lonely, and he told her, and she said, "I think I already know what you mean." And Harold looked at her with something in his face that had memory in it, something that recognized and said, "Yes, I think you probably do." The winter that followed the beginning of the visits was the coldest Millhaven had seen in several years. There were mornings when the temperature dropped into the low 20s, which in Georgia is an event, the kind of cold that the town is structurally and psychologically unprepared for, and the kind that makes pipes burst in houses that were not built for it, and sends people to the hardware store for weather stripping and space heaters. On those mornings, Patricia would wake Maya up a few minutes early so she could get across the street and back before the cold had fully committed to the day. She started sending Maya with 2 bowls on those mornings, one for Harold and one that was already covered and ready, so Harold could eat it while it was hot without having to transfer it. This was not a thing Patricia announced or made a ceremony of. She just did it. And Harold, who noticed everything, noticed this. And the next time Brenda Sims came for her Tuesday visit, he asked her to add a specific tea to the grocery list, a chamomile blend that he had read was good for sleep. Because he had noticed that Patricia was up early enough to be watching from the window by the time Maya crossed the street, and he thought a woman working double shifts at a hospital who was also getting up before dawn to monitor her daughter's safety across the street probably was not sleeping as well as she should be. He had Brenda leave it in a paper bag on the porch one morning, labeled simply, "For Patricia," with no further explanation. Patricia found it when she went to collect the bowl. She stood on Harold's porch holding the paper bag for a long time. She brought it inside. She made the tea that night and sat with it at her kitchen table and thought about what it meant that a man she had never properly spoken to, a man she had been watching from a distance for months, had been watching her right back and had thought to do something about what he saw. That small exchange, the tea in the paper bag with no note beyond 2 words, was the thing that finally moved Patricia from observer to participant. She had been watching Harold from across the street and deciding who he was based on what she could see, the same thing the neighbors were doing, just with better data and more charity. But the tea told her something the window could not. It told her that Harold Bennett was a man who paid attention, and Patricia Watkins, who had spent most of her adult life in environments where nobody with any institutional power paid attention to people like her, knew how rare that was. She started leaving things on the porch for him too. Not food. Maya had the food covered, but small things. A newspaper. Because she had noticed his mail included a subscription that the delivery person sometimes left in the wrong place. A pair of thick socks in a pharmacy bag because Brenda had mentioned in passing, not intending it to be a message, but Patricia received it as one, that Harold's circulation was poor and that his feet were often cold. A paperback from the library book sale because she had heard Harold tell Maya once, in one of the doorstep exchanges she could not quite hear but had been trying to read, that he used to read constantly and had not read much in the past few years because holding a book had become difficult. The paperback was a large print edition. Harold did not comment on this. But the next time Patricia looked at his porch, the book was gone, which meant he had taken it inside, which was all the comment required. This is what genuine community looks like. Not the version that gets photographed for neighborhood association newsletters, not the version that happens at organized events with potluck dishes and name tags, but the version that is built one small deliberate act at a time by people who have decided, without fanfare, that the person nearby matters. Caldwell Avenue did not know it was building a community. It thought it was just going about its business. But Maya was crossing the street every morning, and Patricia was leaving things on the porch. And Brenda Sims was spending 20 minutes more than she was technically required to spend on her Tuesday and Friday visits. And the retired man next door to Harold, named Mr. Ellis, who had not spoken to Harold in 4 years of living beside him, had started mowing the strip of grass between their properties without being asked, which Harold noticed and responded to by leaving a 6-pack of root beer on the fence post with a note that said, "For Mr. Ellis," because the only beverage Harold knew that Mr. Ellis drank was root beer, learned from an overheard conversation on the street that Harold had filed away without knowing why. Mr. Ellis found the root beer on a Thursday morning and stood looking at it for long enough that his wife came out to see what he was looking at, and when he told her, she went back inside and came out 10 minutes later with a plate of biscuits to put on Harold's porch in return. And by 11 o'clock that morning, 3 additional neighbors had left things at Harold's door without quite being able to explain why they felt compelled to do so. Something had shifted on that street. Something had been started. And it had been started by a 9-year-old with a bowl of oatmeal and nothing to prove. The winter turned to spring and spring to summer and summer back to fall. And Maya turned 10 years old, and Harold taught her long division in a way that her teacher had not managed despite 3 separate attempts, by explaining it in terms of the body. The numerator is what you have, the denominator is how many ways you need to share it, and long division is just finding out how many times the sharing can happen before you run out. And Maya said that made more sense than anything her teacher had said, and Harold said he had been teaching cardiology residents since before her mother was born, and that if he could not explain division in terms a child understood, he ought to hand in his credentials. Maya asked what credentials. Harold said it was a figure of speech. Maya said she knew that. She was just asking what kind of credentials. Harold told her, and she sat for a moment on his porch steps and looked at him, this old man in his chair just inside the open door, this man who corrected her grammar and knew about birds and brought tea for her mother. And she said, "You were a heart doctor." And Harold said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you miss it?" And Harold was quiet for long enough that Maya thought she had asked something wrong. And then he said, "I miss the patients. I miss knowing that what I was doing on any given day was keeping someone's heart going." Maya thought about that. Then she said, "Well, that is still what you're doing." Harold looked at her. She looked back at him, 9 years old, completely serious, not performing wisdom, but simply stating what she saw. Harold looked away. He said, "Go home, Maya. It is getting cold." She went home, but she stopped at the edge of the porch and turned back and said, "I mean it, Mr. Harold." And then she crossed the street. Harold sat in his chair for a long time after the sound of her footsteps had gone. Brenda Sims, in her 30 years of home health work, had seen the full range of what isolation does to a person over time. She had seen people become suspicious, becoming convinced through the slow, accumulating logic of loneliness that the world was indifferent to them at best and hostile at worst. She had seen people become rigid, insisting on the same routines and the same arrangements with an intensity that was really about the terror of change in a life that had become very small. She had seen people simply dim, the light going out of them gradually the way a phone battery dies when it has not been charged in too long, still technically functioning, but not at any capacity that was useful to them or to anyone around them. Harold had been dimming when she first began his case. He was not a man who had lost his mind or his dignity, or even, under the right circumstances, his humor. He was a man who had lost the belief that any of it mattered. The mind, the dignity, the humor, all the specific qualities that made Harold Bennett, because there was no one around to reflect that back to him and help him see it. Brenda had done what she could. She was good at her job. But she came twice a week, and she had 19 other patients, and there are limits to what professional care can do in the face of a loneliness that runs that deep and has been running that long. What Maya did was something Brenda could not have done, and nothing in the professional literature of home health care would have suggested as a treatment protocol. But Brenda had been doing this long enough to know that the literature is not always where the answers are. Sometimes the answer is a child in a bowl of oatmeal. Sometimes the answer is that simple and that unlikely and that true. 6 months before Harold was hospitalized, something happened that none of them talked about much afterward, but that Patricia thought about for a long time. It was a Saturday morning, which meant Maya did not have school, which meant she had arrived at Harold's door a little later than usual and stayed a little longer. They had been talking for nearly an hour, which was longer than their usual doorstep conversations, and Harold had at some point moved his chair a few inches further toward the threshold of the door so that he was more fully in the morning air, which was the closest he had come to being outside in several months. They were talking about something Maya had seen on a nature program about the migration patterns of monarch butterflies, a subject Harold knew a great deal about from a brief period in his early medical career when he had also been an amateur lepidopterist, which was a word he used and then had to define and then had to spell and then had to defend when Maya said that collecting butterflies sounded sad, and he said it was a matter of scientific perspective, and she said that the butterflies probably had a scientific perspective too. In the middle of this conversation, Harold stopped. Not the way a person stops when they have lost their train of thought, but the way a person stops when something has occurred to them that they need to say, and they are gathering the nerve. He looked at Maya for a moment. Then he said, "I had a daughter." Present tense shifted to past not because she was gone, but because the relationship, as it had existed, was. He said she was about your age the last time things were good between us. Maya did not say anything. She just looked at him. Harold said, "I was not a good father. Not because I didn't love her. I loved her more than I loved most things. But love and presence are not the same thing, and I confused them for too many years." Maya said, "Is she still alive?" Harold said yes. Maya said, "Then it is not too late." Harold looked at her. He said, "It might be too late." Maya said, "But it might not be." Harold said, "That is an awfully simple way to look at it." And Maya said, "I'm 10 years old, Mr. Harold. Most things look simple from here." Harold looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You are going to be something, Maya Watkins?" She said, "I already am something." He said, "Yes, I know. I just meant something more." She said, "More than what?" He could not find an answer for that. She went home. That afternoon, Harold called his daughter's number, a number he had not dialed in 8 years. Diane did not pick up. He did not leave a message. But he had dialed. And the fact of having dialed, the fact of the attempt, sat with him differently than the 8 years of not attempting had sat. It felt like the first step of something. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like a direction. He did not call again that day, or the next. He was Harold Bennett, and Harold Bennett did not do the easy version of hard things, which was to make the gesture and let the gesture stand in for the work. He sat with what he wanted to say. He thought about what Diane deserved to hear and what he owed her, and what the honest version of an apology from a man who had failed in the specific ways he had failed would actually sound like when it was not wrapped in justification or self-pity. He thought about this for 3 weeks. He thought about it the way he had once thought about difficult diagnoses, methodically and without the comfort of certainty, going over the evidence and the history and the likely outcomes and accepting that he might be wrong and proceeding anyway because proceeding was required. And then one evening he called Diane again, and this time she picked up. And the first 10 seconds of that conversation were the longest 10 seconds Harold had experienced since a time he did not want to remember. And then Diane said, "Dad," and Harold said, "Yes, I am here." And they stayed on the phone for 45 minutes without resolving anything, or fixing anything, or saying everything that needed to be said, but staying on the phone, which was its own kind of beginning. This was happening in the background of the morning visits, in the part of Harold's life that Maya did not see and was not privy to. What Maya saw was that Harold was changing. She could not have articulated precisely how, but children read people in a register that adults often can't access anymore, and what she read in Harold over those months was a gradual reorientation, like a plant turning toward a light source it has just located. He was more present in their conversations. He asked more questions. He told her more about himself, small things, the kind of detail that a person shares when they have started to trust that sharing it will not be used against them. He told her that he had grown up in Georgia, not Millhaven, but a city about 3 hours north, and that he had left the state at 18 with a scholarship and the specific ambition that comes from having grown up in a place where ambition was not always safe to display. He told her that he had worked harder than he had ever told anyone he worked in the years when he was building his career, that the version of success he had achieved had required a sustained effort that had left very little room for anything else, and that he had been wrong about that, had been wrong to make the calculation that the career justified the cost, but that being wrong about it did not undo the work itself or the good it had done. And he was still, at 73 years old, learning how to hold both of those things at the same time. Maya listened to all of this. She was 10. She did not have the framework to fully process what he was telling her. But she stored it, the way children store things they sense are important before they have the capacity to understand them. And she would return to it years later, when she had the life experience to know what he had actually been saying. Patricia, for her part, was navigating something that she had not anticipated when she allowed the morning visits to continue, which was that she was becoming emotionally invested in a man she had never had a full conversation with. She thought about this sometimes at night, the particular strangeness of it, the way that watching someone daily through a window and leaving things on their porch and hearing about them from your child's morning reports had created a portrait of a person that was, in some ways, more honest than the portrait you get from actual direct interaction, because it was built from behavior rather than from what the person chose to present. She knew Harold the way you know a person when you have watched them when they did not know they were being watched, which is to say imperfectly but specifically. She knew that he was proud. She knew that he was precise, that everything in his immediate world was organized in a way that required daily effort given his physical limitations, and that the effort mattered to him. She knew that he was funny, because Maya came home sometimes still smiling about something he had said, and the things that made Maya genuinely laugh were never simple or cheap. She knew that he was lonely in a way that the morning visits were addressing but not curing, and that there was a shape to the loneliness that predated Millhaven, and that no amount of oatmeal and grammar correction was going to reach. And she knew, because she had heard enough in the half-heard doorstep conversations and read enough in the things Maya reported, that Harold Bennett had a daughter somewhere in the world with whom things were not right, and that this was the specific unfinished business that sat at the center of his loneliness, and that until it was addressed, everything else was peripheral. She did not know yet that she was going to be the one to address it. She did not know yet about the number in the drawer. When Harold collapsed in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning in the early spring, the world of Caldwell Avenue reorganized itself around that event with a speed and coherence that surprised everyone, by including the people doing the reorganizing. Brenda Sims called the ambulance and called Patricia in the same breath. Patricia called the school and told them Maya would not be in that day, and then sat with her daughter at the window until the ambulance was gone and the street was quiet again. Mr. Ellis came over without being called and sat in Patricia's kitchen and did not say much but was there, which was what was needed. Mrs. Chapman, the woman 3 doors down who had called twice to express concern about the morning visits, appeared at Patricia's door that afternoon with a dish that she handed over without making a production of it and said, "I hope he comes through." And Patricia said, "Thank you, Dolores." And Mrs. Chapman nodded and went back to her house. Something about the ambulance on that street, about the sudden, vivid evidence that Harold Bennett was real and was mortal and had been living among them this whole time while they had been deciding not to know him, moved through the neighborhood like a current, and people who had been choosing not to see began to see. Patricia drove to the hospital the next morning. She had not planned to go immediately, or at all, because she was not family and she was not sure of her standing. But then she thought about what standing meant, what it was actually built from, and she decided that 30-some odd mornings of watching from a window and paper bags of tea left on porches and a phone number found in a drawer, and 9 days spent deciding whether to dial it, had built her enough standing to walk through a hospital lobby and ask which room Harold Bennett was in. The woman at the front desk told her. She went up. She stood outside the door in the hallway and thought about Patricia Watkins from 10 years ago, the woman who had moved to Caldwell Avenue with a baby and a secondhand sofa, and the particular determination of someone who has decided to build something from very little. And she thought about what that woman would have done in this hallway. Then she knocked and went in. Harold was awake. He was not well, but he was awake. And when he saw Patricia, he did something she had not expected, which was to look relieved. Not merely to recognize her, not merely to be polite, but to look genuinely and specifically relieved. The way a person looks when the person they were hoping would come is the one who walks through the door. She pulled up the chair beside the bed. She said, "Maya sends her love." She wanted to come, but it is a school day. Harold said, "She should be in school." Patricia said, "I know, that is why I left her there." Harold made a sound that was close to a laugh. They sat for a moment. Then Patricia said, "I found a number in your drawer the last time I was at your house. I called it." Harold went still. Patricia said, "I spoke to Diane." Harold looked at the ceiling. Patricia said, "She is coming." Harold said, "You had no right to do that." His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man who has been bracing for something for a long time and is finally feeling it arrive. Patricia said, "You kept the number, Harold." And Harold said nothing for a long time. And then he said, "Yes, I kept it." Patricia nodded. She said, "She is coming." Harold closed his eyes, a long exhale. The sound of a man who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just been told he can let go. Diane Bennett arrived 2 days later. She was 40 years old, and she carried herself with the particular composure of a woman who's built a life she is proud of and who has learned, through years of practice, to keep the things that hurt contained in a way that allows her to function. She was good at functioning. She had been good at it since she was a teenager, and her parents' marriage had stopped being a marriage, and she had learned, as children of failing marriages learn, that someone has to hold things together, and that someone was going to be her. She had held things together for 22 years without her father. She had made a good life, a real one. And with people in it who loved her and work she found meaningful, and children of her own who were growing up in a house where people stayed and showed up and could be counted on. She had done all of that without Harold. And now Patricia Watkins, a woman she had never met, a woman who had found a number in a drawer and had the nerve to dial it, was telling her that her father was in a hospital in a small Georgia town, and that the time for the absence to end was now, if it was ever going to end. She stood outside his hospital room door for 3 minutes. People who were in that hallway that morning would later describe it as one of the more striking things they had seen in a hospital corridor, which is saying something given the things that happen in hospital corridors. She stood very still. She was not crying. She was not visibly agitated. She was simply standing, gathering something, and anyone who has ever had to walk into a room where a parent they have complicated feelings about is lying in a hospital bed knows what she was gathering and knows that 3 minutes is not very long to gather it. She went in. Harold turned his head. She said, "I am here." He said her name. And then she stood at the foot of his bed, not rushing to him, not keeping her distance either, just present, just there, which was the thing she had spent 22 years being unable to be, and which was, it turned out, the only thing that had ever actually been required. They talked that day for 4 hours, not continuously, because Harold tired easily and because some of what they said required pauses to absorb before the next thing could be said. They did not resolve everything. They were never going to resolve everything, And it would have been dishonest and ultimately damaging to pretend that 4 hours of conversation could dissolve 22 years of hurt. What they did was begin. Diane said things she had never said because she had never had the chance. Harold said things he had never said because he had never had the courage. He did not make excuses. That was important. He had excuses available, the pressures of his career, the particular blindnesses of his generation, the mental health struggles he had not understood he was having while he was having them. But he did not deploy them as shields. He offered them only as context, as information, as pieces of the picture rather than as reasons why the picture was not his fault. Diane listened to all of it. She was not ready to forgive him that day. Not formally, not fully. But she was there. And she came back the next day, and the day after that. And she extended her hotel reservation twice, and then a third time, until she had been in Millhaven for 3 weeks, which was 3 weeks longer than she had planned, and which her husband, a patient and perceptive man named Thomas, encouraged without condition, because he had been watching his wife carry this for 22 years, and he understood what it would mean for her to put it down. It was during this time, during the 3 weeks when Diane was in Millhaven and Harold was in the hospital, and Patricia was managing both his house and her daughter's education and her own job with the quiet organizational competence that defined everything she did, that Patricia first mentioned Harold to an old friend of hers named Gloria, who worked in healthcare administration and who, over the course of a very long phone call one evening, asked Patricia to describe Harold in a way that went beyond his medical situation. Patricia described him. She told Gloria about the tea in the paper bag. She told Gloria about the grammar corrections and the lepidopterist phase, and the way he had looked when Diane walked through the door. She told Gloria about the number in the drawer that had been folded and refolded until the creases wore through the paper. Gloria listened to all of this and then said, "Patricia, what are you going to do when he comes home?" And Patricia said, "What do you mean I'm going to keep doing what I have been doing? Making sure he is okay." And Gloria said, "Yes, but what about you?" Patricia said she did not understand the question. Gloria said, "I think you understand the question." Patricia said she was not having this conversation. Gloria said that was fine. She would be here when Patricia was ready to have it. Patricia said goodnight and hung up and stood in her kitchen for a few minutes, thinking about what Gloria had meant, and then decided she was not going to think about what Gloria had meant, and went to bed and lay awake for quite a while thinking about what Gloria had meant. This matters to the story not because Patricia's feelings for Harold were romantic in any conventional sense, though they were feelings, real and complicated and worth naming, but because it illustrates something important about what happens when you decide to show up for another person on a sustained basis. You do not emerge from that experience unchanged. The sustained attention that care requires, the daily accumulation of small knowledge about another person, the investment of your time and your worry and your thought, all of that does something to you. It opens a connection that did not exist before and that, once open, is not easily closed. Patricia had set out to make sure a sick old man was not dying alone because her daughter had started feeding him and she felt responsible. What she had ended up doing was knowing him. And knowing a person, truly knowing them, is always a form of love, even when the love is specific and bounded and does not require a name. Harold came home on a Wednesday morning in early April. The street that received him was different from the street he had left 7 weeks earlier. Mr. Ellis had mowed the front lawn. Mrs. Chapman's contribution was visible in the pot of geraniums by the front door, which she had chosen because they were hardy and would survive with minimal attention, a practical act of care that was entirely in keeping with who she was. The refrigerator was stocked because Patricia had done the shopping and organized a roster of neighbors to contribute items, a thing she had done without making it official, or giving it a name because she knew that if she made it official and gave it a name, some people would find reasons to opt out. Whereas, if she just asked directly and specifically, "Could you bring a rotisserie chicken Thursday? Could you bring a case of that ginger ale he likes?" People would generally do the specific thing they had been asked to do because it was concrete and immediate, and it was clear how it would help. Diane was there. She had been at the house since early morning, making sure everything was ready, which meant she had been in Harold's house alone for several hours, moving through the rooms of her father's life for the first time, seeing the photograph on the mantel, seeing the large print paperback from Patricia on the side table, seeing the careful organization of the medication bottles that spoke of a man who was still trying to manage himself with the precision he had once applied to managing other people's health. She stood in front of the photograph for a long time. It was a picture of a younger Harold in a suit at what appeared to be a conference or award ceremony, holding a plaque of some kind and smiling the smile of a man who believes in that moment that the trajectory of his life is upward and will continue to be. She thought about that man. She thought about the gap between that man and the one in the hospital bed she had been visiting for 3 weeks. She thought about all the years the gap represented. And then she heard the medical transport van pull up outside and she put those thoughts away, not permanently but for later, for the ongoing processing that she knew would take years and that she had decided she was willing to do. Maya was at school when Harold came home. Patricia had made the call that education was not optional, regardless of the emotional significance of the morning. And Maya had accepted this with the particular combination of frustration and respect that characterized her relationship with her mother's decisions. She had made Harold a card. It was decorated in the colors he had mentioned once were his favorites, dark blue and green. All the colors he associated with the ocean, which he had told her he had not seen in several years and missed more than he had expected to miss it. The card said, "Welcome home, Mr. Harold. I made your favorite for tomorrow morning." She had not told Patricia what the favorite was. She had spent 3 days figuring it out from the scraps of information available to her, which was one part detective work and one part educated inference. And she had landed on blueberry pancakes, which she had never made before and was going to have to practice that afternoon, which she did, making 2 practice batches while Patricia supervised, the second of which was genuinely good. Patricia tasted one and said it was ready. Maya covered the bowl and put it in the refrigerator and went to bed that night with the particular satisfaction of a person who has a plan and knows it is a good one. The next morning, Maya crossed the street with blueberry pancakes. Harold's door opened before she knocked. He was dressed. He was in actual clothes, not the robe she had first seen him in, and he looked like he had slept, and he looked like he had been thinking about something pleasant because the expression on his face when she handed him the dish towel was something she had not seen before, something that was more than the familiar almost smile, something fuller. He looked at her. He said, "Blueberry." She said, "You told me once you used to grow blueberries." He said, "I told you that 8 months ago." She said, "I know." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I would like to eat this inside if you will sit on the steps and talk to me through the screen door, because the doctor has told me I need to limit the time I stand in drafts." Maya said she thought the screen door counted as a draft. Harold said that was a very good point and that she should be a lawyer. She said she was thinking about medicine. Harold went very still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think you probably should." She sat on the steps. He went inside and sat at his kitchen table with his blueberry pancakes, and they talked through the screen door for 30 minutes about the monarch butterfly migration pattern and the difference between a crow and a raven, and the exact nature of the error Maya's math teacher had made on the board the previous Wednesday, which Maya had been too polite to point out, but which Harold said she should not have been, that being precise about errors was not rudeness, but honesty, and that the world needed more of both. It was the most ordinary morning on Caldwell Avenue. It was one of the best mornings Harold Bennett could remember in a very long time. The months that followed Harold's return from the hospital were a time of gradual reconstruction, not dramatic, not linear, not without setbacks. Harold had 2 additional hospitalizations in the following year, one for a complication with his heart medications and one for a respiratory infection that settled in his lungs and made Brenda Sims worry in a way she did not always let Harold see. He came home from both of them. Each time he came home, he was a little more deliberate about the life he was returning to and a little more specific about what he wanted the remaining time to contain. He had conversations with Diane, on the phone and in person during her increasingly frequent visits, that went further than the first conversations had, that got to the things underneath the obvious things, the childhood memories and the specific moments that had shaped how each of them understood the other, and that had never been spoken about, because speaking about them required a degree of vulnerability that Harold, for most of his life, had not been equipped to offer. He offered it now, not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently and with the intention of someone who has understood, late, that the alternative to this difficulty is a worse difficulty, and that he does not have the time or the willingness to choose the worse one. Diane's children, Harold's grandchildren, a boy of 9 named Marcus and a girl of 7 named Claire, video called Harold for the first time in February of the year following his hospitalization. It was Diane's idea. She had prepared them for it, told them who Harold was in terms that were honest without being weighted with the adult complications they were too young to carry. She said he was her dad, that they had been out of touch for a while, that she was glad they were talking again. Marcus asked immediately if Harold was the grandpa who was a heart doctor, and Harold said yes, and Marcus said, "Do you know what a defibrillator is?" And Harold said he did indeed. And Marcus said, "Can you explain how it works?" Because the description in his science book didn't make sense. Harold explained it. Marcus said that was the best explanation he had ever heard. Harold said thank you and meant it more than Marcus could have known. Claire, who was 7, asked if Harold had a dog. Harold said no. Claire said he should get a dog. Harold said he was not sure he could take care of a dog. Claire said, "You could get a small one. They are easier." Harold said he would consider it. He did not get a dog, but he thought about the conversation for days, the easy, uncomplicated desire of a 7-year-old to make the world better for a grandfather she had just met, the simplicity of the solution she had offered, just get a small one. They are easier. He thought it was the kind of thinking the world needed more of, and that most adults had been trained out of long before they were 7. Richard Calloway had driven down to Millhaven on the same day he did, because Diane had given him the address and told him that time was not a luxury they had in abundance. The settlement he brought with him had been in process for 2 years, part of a broader institutional reckoning that several medical centers had undertaken after sustained pressure from researchers and advocacy organizations who had been documenting attribution inequities in academic medicine for years. Harold's name had come up in the course of a comprehensive audit, attached to a study that had been generating downstream impact for over 2 decades, a study whose influence on cardiac care for underserved communities was traceable and significant, a study whose primary author had received recognition and whose contributing researchers had not. The audit had identified several such cases. Harold's was among the most clear-cut because the records were well preserved, and the documentation of his contribution was specific and unambiguous. Someone had done the right thing when the research was being done, which was to document carefully. The wrong thing that had followed, the failure to attribute properly, did not erase the evidence of what the right thing had looked like. And so, 25 years after the fact, with Harold Bennett lying in a hospital bed in Millhaven, Georgia, a briefcase arrived containing the acknowledgement that the work he had done in the worst year of his personal life had mattered specifically and significantly, had contributed to a body of knowledge that was still protecting hearts in hospitals across the country. Like Harold read every document twice. He asked 3 questions, he signed where he was asked to sign, and then he sat for a long time in his hospital bed in the quiet of that room with Diane and Patricia and Brenda Sims. And he thought about the man he had been when he worked on that study, the man who was distracted and failing and falling, and who had nonetheless sat down at his desk on enough consecutive evenings to produce work that was worth producing. He thought about what it would have meant to that man to know this, to know that the work was good, that the distraction had not contaminated the rigor, that even in the middle of a life that was coming apart, he had done something that would hold. He thought that the man he had been then would have wept to know it. He thought about what it meant now. And then he said what he said about thinking that nothing from that year had mattered. And Richard Calloway, who had driven from Boston to a small Georgia hospital to tell his old colleague that it had, reached across and briefly gripped Harold's hand, and Harold, who was not a man who accepted that kind of gesture easily, let him. The trust Harold established for Maya was the kind of decision that can only be made by a person who has arrived at a clarity about what matters that most people only approach, if they approach it at all, at the very end. He had money now, not a great deal, by the standards of the world he had once been adjacent to, but more than he needed for his remaining years, and Harold was not a man who had ever been interested in excess. He had spent the first part of his adult life acquiring things and the second part losing them, and had arrived at the far end of his life with a view of acquisition that was uncomplicated and unfavorable. What he had found at the far end, what he had been surprised to find, was that the thing he wanted to do with what he had was to make it possible for someone else to do something that he had once been given the chance to do and had squandered. He had been educated because someone paid for it. He had been given opportunities because people opened doors. He had used those gifts imperfectly, and he had wasted some of them, and he had ultimately not done with his life the things his life had been positioned to make possible. And a girl had crossed the street with Oatmeal every morning for 14 months, with no knowledge of any of this, and had given him 2 more years of life in which to come to terms with it. The least he could do was make sure she had the door. Patricia received the call from the attorney on a Thursday afternoon. She was standing in the parking lot of the grocery store, having just loaded the trunk, and she had to sit in the driver's seat for several minutes after the call ended before she felt capable of driving. She called Harold from the parking lot. She said what she said about not having to. Harold said what he said about letting him give it. And then, because neither of them were people who extended conversations past the point of completion, they said goodnight, and Patricia drove home, and she made dinner, and she helped Maya with homework, and she did not say anything about the trust that evening because she was still absorbing it, still turning it over, still trying to find the right frame for what it meant that this man she had watched from a window for over a year and left things on his porch for, and driven to the hospital, and sat beside and argued gently with and thought about in the way that you think about people who have become, without formal announcement, important, had looked at her daughter and seen a future worth investing in. She told Maya when Maya was 12. She sat her down and explained it clearly, in the terms that Patricia always used with her daughter, which were direct and complete and treated Maya as a person capable of handling true things. Maya listened. She asked her question about whether Harold had felt obligated. Patricia told her what Harold had said. Maya thought for a long time. Then she said that she was glad. Not, I cannot believe it. Not, this is amazing. Just, I am glad. And then she said, can I go see him tomorrow morning? And Patricia said, you go every morning. And Maya said, I know, but I want to see him tomorrow morning specifically. Patricia said, of course. And the next morning, Maya crossed the street with Harold's oatmeal and sat on the porch steps, and they talked about nothing in particular, about the oak tree and the birds and a book Maya was reading for school. And Harold corrected a grammatical error she made describing the plot, and she said she knew she had done it on purpose to see if he was paying attention. And Harold said he had been paying attention since October of the year she was 9 years old and intended to continue. And Maya said good, because she was going to need someone to proofread her college application essays someday, and Harold said he looked forward to it. She did not mention the trust. He did not mention it either. It existed between them as the thing it was, which was simply an extension of the ongoing fact of their care for each other, money being in this case the form that care took, the same way oatmeal had once been the form it took. Different vessel, same thing. In the last 18 months of his life, Harold Bennett was more alive than he had been in the 20 years preceding them. This is not a sentimental exaggeration. It is a clinical observation that Brenda Sims made in the notes she kept, not in the formal records, but in the personal journal she had maintained throughout her career. A habit she had developed early on, because the formal records never had room for the things that actually mattered. She wrote that Harold Bennett, in the final period of his life, demonstrated a quality of engagement with his circumstances that she associated with people who had found a reason. Not a reason in the grand philosophical sense, not a purpose with a capital P, but a reason in the daily practical sense, a reason to get up and get dressed and open the door when the knock came. Maya was the reason. Diane and the grandchildren were the reason. Patricia and her quietly efficient presence in his life were the reason. Mr. Ellis and his root beer and his mowed strips of grass were the reason. Brenda herself was the reason. Harold had, in the last years of his life, accumulated people. Not in the networking sense, but in the genuine sense. People who knew him and whom he knew and with whom his continued existence was connected in ways that made it matter to all of them that he kept existing. That is what community actually is. That is what it actually does. And Harold Bennett had found it, or it had found him, late and unlikely, and on a street in a small Georgia town that he had come to in order to disappear, and it had made him real again. The 5th grade science fair has already been mentioned, but it deserves more space because it was more significant than it might appear. Harold had not been to a public event of any kind in 4 years when Diane convinced him to come. She had driven down for the weekend specifically because Maya had invited Harold, and Harold had agreed, which Diane took as a significant development worth supporting with her physical presence. Harold wore his best remaining suit, which Brenda had had dry cleaned for the occasion, without mentioning to Harold that she had done it, leaving it on his doorstep the evening before in a cleaner's bag with no note. He arrived at the school gymnasium with his cane and Diane's arm, and the particular expression of a man who has committed to something and is going to see it through regardless of how it feels. The gymnasium smelled like paper and institutional cleaning product, and that particular school smell that is composed of many things, but that Harold associated with Diane's childhood, with picking her up from events like this one, or rather with not picking her up from events like this one, because he had often not been there, and he had no illusions about which version he represented in the stored memories of the child who was now 40 years old and walking beside him. He sat in the folding chair that a teacher had placed in the aisle for him because navigating the rows was difficult, and he watched Maya present her project to the judges with the focused clarity of a child who has been taught, by someone she trusted, that precision matters. Her project was on the effectiveness of specific dietary interventions in managing congestive heart failure in middle-aged and elderly patients. Harold had provided her with 3 research papers to cite. She cited them correctly. The judges gave her second place. Harold's opinion of the judges was not revised by the experience of watching them work, but he was there. He had been there. And Maya had looked up from her presentation 3 times to find him in the audience, and each time she found him, he gave her the small nod that was the Harold Bennett equivalent of a standing ovation, and she had understood it as such. He died on a Sunday morning in April, 2 years and 4 months after Richard Calloway knocked on the door of his house and Patricia answered. The spring had come early that year in Millhaven, the azaleas already out, the mornings warm enough to leave a window open. Diane had come down for a visit and had been sleeping in the second bedroom when she heard Harold moving in the early hours and had gotten up and gone to him. And they had talked for a while in the way they had learned to talk in the night hours of his difficult spells, which was quietly and without agenda. Just the 2 of them in the dark, being present with each other, and with whatever was being said without being said. When he went quietly, which was consistent with everything else about Harold Bennett in those last years. The quiet man who had learned, finally, to let people see him. Patricia heard from Diane shortly after dawn. She went across the street immediately and sat with Diane in Harold's living room while the necessary calls were made, the familiar, terrible sequence of calls that follow a death. And she made coffee because there had to be something to do with her hands, and coffee was something. Maya was told when she woke up. She was 13, and she understood death, and she understood that this death in particular was a loss that had a specific shape, the shape of all the mornings, all the bowls and the dish towels, all the conversations through the screen door, and the grammar corrections and the explanations of long division, and the blueberry pancakes, and the science fair, and the oak tree, and everything that had accumulated between them over 4 years into a thing she did not have a name for, but that was real, and was hers, and was now changed by this. She sat on his porch steps for a long time. The morning was warm. The oak tree was full with spring leaves. The birds, the crows, and the ravens that Harold had taught her to distinguish were in the upper branches. She sat and she let herself feel all of it. Then she went home and made herself breakfast and ate it at the kitchen table with Patricia and Diane and did not try to make it anything other than what it was. His headstone reads, Harold Joseph Bennett, physician, father, neighbor. He mattered. And Diane chose the words. She said she wanted something that was true and that Harold would not find excessive, and that she thought covered the things that needed to be covered. Patricia agreed that it covered them. The flowers at the grave are always fresh. Maya goes on the first Saturday of every month, which is the Saturday that Brenda Sims first mentioned to her that Harold's birthday had been in October, which was how the birthday card had started, and Maya has carried the habit of the first Saturday forward into this new form because she is Maya Watkins, and she does not stop showing up simply because the form of the showing up needs to change. Now here is what this story is, underneath everything. It is not a story about a little girl and an old man. It is a story about what happens when one person refuses to look away. Every element of what this story contains, the reconnection of a father and daughter, the legal recognition of work long overdue for acknowledgement, the transformation of a neighborhood that had decided not to know itself, the education trust, the science fair, the blueberry pancakes, the grandchildren on a video call, the spring morning, and the open window. All of it is downstream of one decision. A 9-year-old girl on an October morning decides that the person behind the closed door matters and acts accordingly. That is the whole seed of it. Everything else is what grew. There is a real woman. Her name was Grace. She lived in a town in Illinois. And she spent 100 years being quietly present in the lives of the people around her and quietly building something with the small investment she had made in a company she believed in and which she never spent until there was nothing left to spend, and then she gave every cent of it to the young people who needed what it could buy them. Nobody who knew her was surprised by who she was when she died. They were surprised only by the number. The character had been visible the whole time. She had been the person who showed up. She had been the person who stayed. She had been the person who, when she saw someone who needed feeding, brought food, and when she saw someone who needed company, offered it, and when she had something to give, gave it without making the recipient feel that receiving it cost them anything. That is the life that Harold, in the end, was trying to approximate. He did not get 100 years to do it. He got the last 4. But 4 years, lived with that intention, turned out to be enough to matter in ways that will not stop mattering. Maya Watkins will go to college. She has decided on medicine, which she discussed with Harold for 3 months before his death, and which he encouraged without reservation, which from Harold was the most unambiguous form of endorsement available. She will go because of the trust, and because of her mother, and because of everything those two people built around her to make it possible. And she will carry, into whatever she becomes, the knowledge that the most significant thing she has ever done was the simplest. She crossed a street, she knocked on a door, she left a bowl, she came back the next morning. She did not ask permission. She did not calculate the odds. She did not wait for someone better positioned to do it first. She saw a person who was not being seen, and she saw him. That is the whole of it. And the whole of it, it turns out, is everything. If you are watching this today, and there is a herald on your street, in your building, in your family, in the place you go every day and have stopped truly seeing, I want to leave you with just one question. Not what should you do about it, not how you might begin, just the question that Maya Watkins never needed to ask herself, but that the rest of us might need to sit with for a moment before we answer it honestly. The question is, what is stopping you? Not what would it cost, not whether you have time, just what is stopping you. Because if the answer is nothing, then the bowl is already made, and the dish towel is in the drawer, and the only thing left is to cross the street. Thank you for spending this time with this story. It is the kind of story that deserves to be shared, and if it reached you today, please pass it to the person in your life who needs to be reminded that small things matter, that sustained things matter, that the choice to show up quietly and consistently for another person is among the most powerful choices available to a human being, regardless of age or resources or circumstance. Leave us a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if there is a Harold in your life or a Maya. Tell us the part of this story that stayed with you. We read every comment, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Because we have more stories to tell, and each one is worth your time and your attention, and you should not have to miss them. We will see you in the next one.